So it's a pleasure to start this webinar today that focuses on post-market clinical studies in non-traditional settings. I'll explain what we mean by that, and we'll talk about pitfalls that we as a CRO have often encountered in our daily life here. So what is the challenge and why non-traditional settings have higher, stronger challenges than traditional PMCF studies? Well, one of the challenges is designing studies that are really close to the scope that they should have. This may seem quite obvious, but sometimes we see that that's not the case. We see protocols that are not really purpose-built, and they take too much from pre-market study protocols. They're cloning it with a number of consequences that I'll touch on later on. Then the challenge clearly is the challenge for any study. So avoid delay, be able to start the study quickly and optimize cost. Don't spend money that you're not supposed to spend, and therefore optimize planning. And then the last bullet point here mentions something which is really crucial, is choosing the right partners in your study. That's even more important and relevant when we talk of non-traditional settings, and that part is going to be covered by Matteo Mosso in the next presentation. So why are we seeing more and more PMCF studies done in unusual settings? And well, I took this sentence on the internet, and it seems that there's quite common consensus that between 5 and 10 times increase in PMCF activities and studies. Why? I mean, clearly this is linked to MDR implementation, to enforce the regulatory requirements. We'll hear from the two representatives of the notified bodies that we have here today, what they can tell us. And the enforcement touches all device classes, and that's a key point. Sometimes we've been seeing that there are specific data that are missing from the initial submissions that are requested by notified bodies on certain indications and populations. And then we have the group of legacy devices that for which we see gaps in data, in clinical data, so they're unable to achieve NDRC marking without running another study. And sometimes the gaps are so big that we see very complex studies, and I'm talking about randomized clinical studies in a post-market setting. So it's sort of chimera between something that should be relatively simple with the highest complexity, that is the randomized clinical study. What I've depicted here, it's just with no text. The text comes on the next slide, but basically, what is the shift that we are experiencing as a CRO? So there are a lot more studies and a lot more unusual sites where we find ourselves to work. So on the left is the traditional work. I mean, I'm not so young that I've only seen the part on the right. Actually, I've seen most of the times the part on the left, so big hospitals and clinics. And I mean, this is a surgery room. Clearly, it doesn't need to be that, but it gives you a feel of the environment where the studies were run until most studies were run. And then a very varied and well-educated team. So with several medical doctors, sometimes each with their specialty, nurses, study coordinators, etc. More and more we see the situations depicted on the right, where the environment is different, the number of people involved is different, the education and the roles of the healthcare professionals is different. not to mention the home use and wearables, for example, where the data collection environment is patient's home. This is a bit listed here. So we're seeing more and more small private practices being involved, such as GP offices, physiotherapist offices, sometimes residential homes. So really different types of settings, patients' homes, I've touched on that. In this condition, sometimes a physician is not even present on a regular basis. So the people that as a CRO, as a study monitor, introducing or explaining the study to a clinical site, you have that most of the people are not physicians, so they have no clue of what the ethics declaration is or GCPs, etc. They have a lot more background in clinical research, so a lot less. And even the way that they're organized, the tools, the desks, the space that they have, it's limited. People and equipment. When I was preparing these slides, I had a number of ideas, and I realized that some of the pitfalls that we do see for studies in this type of unusual settings are really common to all PMCF studies. That's why I'll introduce some of pitfalls that we see across all the PMCF studies, not only those in the unusual environments. And I'm touching on the planning phase here. So this is really crucial. So it's the identification of the population of the study that is the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And quite often we see studies that start as observational studies. That's how they call themselves. And then they have inclusion-exclusion criteria mirroring, just copy and paste from the instructions for use. This means that patient selection and assignment to the treatment depends on the study, which is exactly the opposite of what should happen in an observational study, where you just record what happens in real life. And if this is there are situations and type of studies where this is required. But if the study is truly observational, treatment with a device, and that goes into the second bullet point here, treatment implantation of the device is independent from the study, it would happen anyway. And that's crucial to clarify that. It has a number of consequences of confusion and even financial implications, okay? Something else I want to mention is the off-label use. So if investigators are asked to check before they treat the patients that all the instructions for use are respected, that is the inclusion-exclusion criteria of their study, this means that by definition, they're not including off-label use in their tests. And they are checked by the assigned clinical monitor that they do their work well, right? So you are not gonna gather any information on off-label use, how it happens in real world. And so there are several consequences to that. First of all, as you, most of you know, the MDR is one objective is to exactly to detect off-label use. So if the study is observational, this is a mistake because you're excluding off-label patients. And you're making sure that the investigator does not enroll any off-label patient. There are other reasons. I'll bring two simple examples on that. We worked with a company 3-4 years ago that following the identification of extensive off-label use for their product, so their product was used in an indication that was not part of the CE marking. The extent of this phenomenon was so high that they believed that they wanted to protect their company. So what they did is to include they've included in their IFUs a big warning statement saying, warning, do not use this device for this indication because it has safety implications. So they did this to protect themselves, okay? And I think that this was a very useful thing to do. A second aspect that we've encountered in our CRO life is the fact that off-label use may represent a potential new indication for the product. I have an example here of a CE-marked product that had to be used together with another device. So they had to be used with another component, let's say. The company detected in one site that this doctor was actually using the device alone, so off-label, without the second component. But they found this interesting. So what they've done, they made up their mind. They are now running, and we're close to the end actually, a pre-market study for the new indication because they found it interesting. Okay. So off-label use can be important. And I think that I also covered the second point. So there is no screening step. If your study is observational, you talk to a patient that whether or not they participate in the study, they will have treatment anyway. This is linked to this bullet point here. Clarify as much as possible standard of care versus study-specific procedures. And so often this is not present in study protocols. And this impacts investigators' fees, the money that the company has to pay. Not to mention the regulatory process, because there are going to be, we have seen just today, very long feedback from an ethics committee just asking that this is specified in the protocol. And then other elements that would simply make understanding the study design and its regulatory classification more complex. So you will start having a ping pong with the authorities of questions and misunderstanding. So clarify if the study is with or without invasive, burdensome procedures, and it will be very useful to at least say what is your classification of the study, what you believe is the classification of the study with reference to MDR Article 82 or 74.1. And then use descriptors of the study. I have to say that this is done quite often, but sometimes it's not clarifying the matter. I still see often the use of term of registry, which at least in Europe is not so common. I know it's mentioned in the standard ISO 14155, still it creates a lot of confusion. So now this is common really across all types of study. What is more needed for the studies that we've talked earlier, that's non-traditional settings. So consider that the sites will likely not have any experience in most cases with clinical research, sometimes very little. Don't assume that they do, and consider heavy training time. Heavy means 2 times, 3 times, and start from the very basics with examples, graphics, slides. You know, you are not at the university. We are used to work in sessions where they say, okay, GCP, very interesting. I've heard this 100 times. This is primary school, so start from the very basics. Since these sites are sometimes smaller, consider enrollment boosting strategies such as ads and social use, which may not be required in larger practices. Simplify procedures as much as possible. This is all linked to the fact that these sites are not used and probably don't have, actually, they never had study coordinator assigned to the work. Make it easy for them as much as reasonably possible. Reduce staff burden. Again, this can be done, but you need to think of this. For example, allow and bring source data into the CRF. That's one example. And in case of home use, make sure that you choose user-friendly, simple, and efficient electronic patient-reported outcome, if that's what you're gonna use. Okay, that's my last slide. So summarizing, do not copy and paste from pre-market studies. That's a very common mistake. Oops, sorry, I think you're seeing the poll here. Make sure that your all study documents, and I'm talking of the informed consent, the study protocol, the case report form, if necessary. But essentially, these two documents, they specify what is the scope of the study, the regulatory classification, and which procedures are standard of care compared to the study specific. Because you're supposed to pay only for the study specific procedures. If there's confusion here, your budget is gonna go up. Plan ahead for enrollment issues if they are there. Simplify site work, make it as easy as possible, and train, and train. Okay.
Daniela, that was great. I wanted to give the notified body speakers a chance to comment on this if they'd like. Let's start with Katalin.
Oh, yes. So from the notified body perspective, indeed, we did see a huge shift from traditional settings to non-traditional settings. So my background is dentistry and aesthetics, so this is where I'm going to pull a few examples. So now we don't see that much of PMCF studies in hospitals, but rather dental clinics, private dental clinics, aesthetic clinics, private dermatology practices. And in theory, this is great, but because this is where the devices are actually used. And it's also good from a real world evidence standpoint, and it makes sense. But the catch is what has been mentioned here already, that these sites are not built for research. So they may not understand good clinical practice, and sometimes there is a lack of infrastructure for the documentation, for the monitoring and follow-up. And sometimes they don't even understand the burden that comes with a PMCF study for these clinics. So they do need extra planning, training, and support. And if this extra training is not provided to them, that can lead to huge financial issues and burden, as well as headaches, and sometimes even repetition or repeat of the study. I've got an example here coming from, it's a true story that happened. For a derma filler company, they came up with 2 clinics, a PMCF study aiming for around 100 patients. And this 100 patient was statistically justified. And then one of the sites completely fell apart for a simple reason, and that being that the staff was not properly trained for collecting consent. And that led at the end of the study that the entire site had to be excluded, leaving them only with around 60 valid patients, and had to start an entire new PMCF study. And again, so that was bumps and delays, tens of thousands of euros, and a lot of frustration. So yeah, so this is a real example of the complications of missed training opportunities for the sites.
Diane, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, just in short, I just wanted to say that devices can be used in very complex areas that are not just the traditional setting, as Daniela showed us. You know, there's varying patient characteristics, novel devices where there's a learning curve, and then also evolving practice, clinical practice in all these areas. And many devices in these non-traditional sites, because devices take time to show their clinical benefit and risk, you know, going outside of these larger university centers, as you stated, allows for gathering this data in a very important way.
Excellent. Shall we move to Matteo's presentation?
I think we can.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Right. Oops.
Perfect.
Okay, let me see if I manage to make this. Okay. Oops. Okay. Can you see it right, Sean?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. So yes, welcome everybody again. So thank you for joining this webinar. I really hope that you will find my presentation somehow interesting with some useful insights when it comes to site management. I will be presenting, showing and describing true events that occurred to us during the course of recent studies that we have performed within the post-market clinical follow-up setting. And specifically, I will be touching after a just very brief presentation, introduction, which, well, mostly has been covered by the other presenter. I will be touching three main areas where we found the most difficulties, so which were in site selection, site training, as this was already mentioned, and the issues that we have observed in terms of performance of the sites. And during the conclusions, I will be describing how we try to face all these issues and which are the suggestions that we want to present to the audience. So just briefly, as we are describing the fact that we are most of the post-market clinical studies need to be performed in the facilities where the device is intended to be used, and as it has been already discussed, this does not I mean, big hospitals, big university centers, or big clinics do not represent the target. So I will be showing you which were the settings that we have been involved with and these scenarios that we have faced in these studies. So yes, moving to the first area, so site selection challenges. Let's see, first of all, that we need to distinguish two different settings. So one is where the device is already available at the site, or countries where it is already marketed. And in this case, I mean, we can talk about physiotherapy centers, private practices. And there are instances where the device is not yet available. So, and let's say in these circumstances, we will be discussing about the nursing homes. So which were the difficulties in site selection? So in the first case where the device is not yet available and the situation relative to nursing homes, we found extremely difficult finding contacts, having someone who replied to our phone calls, emails. Just to mention that we were aiming to select between 3 and 8 sites, and we sent out more than 50 emails, and we received only 3 replies, 2 of which were saying we are not interested, and the third one that responded, tell me a little bit more, then ended up saying no, we are not interested. So we found really extremely complex trying to reach the right person in the nursing homes. And this is also because mainly the type of contacts that are available in the internet are commercial contacts. So it was really extremely difficult, and they don't have clinical research managers or clinical research staff that understands what you are trying to propose. So, and we will see at the end of the presentation how we managed to get through that. On the other hand, in case, let's say, the difficulties that we have faced when it comes to sites where there is already the presence of the device, and let's say there is a strong input from the sales team or the marketing division of the sponsor. In most circumstances, site selection and site qualification is performed by the sponsor. So not digging really deeply into the critical aspects that a CRO is aware of. So this we will see along the presentation, which were the difficulties that this has brought. So aside of site selection, moving to the training challenges, Daniela has already mentioned part of this aspect. So the critical elements that we have found to be that you need to particularly take care of is, first of all, the lack of GCP knowledge. So describing or talking about principal investigator, sub-investigator, study coordinator often means nothing to the people you are talking to. You see faces that are lost, completely lost when you try to describe some basic concept. Also regarding, for example, source documents, the simple fact that corrections need to be performed according to GCP principles. What do you think that we found during sort of the verification? That in many circumstances, the correction fluid was used to cover the mistakes. So this demonstrates that it is somehow difficult to explain some kind of basic concepts relative to GCPs. Another important aspect is relative to the use of the ECRF, which is very common to people who already are working in hospitals and are used to do clinical research. But as we have seen, the type of settings that are, I mean, this kind of non-traditional settings, they have never seen an ECRF. So, for example, simple things like doing corrections in dynamic forms can create big problems. So just to mention something like, if you select male or female, and then another page automatically opens saying, is it pregnant or not? If you select female and you do a corrections in the first form, this automatically reflects also in the second one. And sometimes this is not understood, and you end up in having the ECRF, which is then messed up. Or another Funny thing was relative to edit checks. If you enter a date which is outside of the protocol specified range, you normally get a warning saying, are you sure this is the correct date? And some of the investigators were just changing the date until they found one that did not fire the edit check, just because they were afraid that the warning was an error message that they were doing something wrong. So understanding some of the concepts behind the use of the tools for a study is sometimes very difficult to explain. And another big problem was relative to making them understand that running a study is not the same as doing standard practice. So as Katalin was also mentioning, the fact that some adverse events are not captured because they are thought to be standard occurrence, something that is normally happening. So nothing to be different from the normal practice, or following study procedures such as doing visits at specific time points sometimes has created big concerns with the investigators. So moving ahead to what were the issues relative to site performance. So we have noticed several errors that were done. Some of those were relative to the ECRF, as I partially mentioned, but just to give you another example, we discovered that in one of the sites where they had to report into the ECRF some basic demographic information of the user of the device, we were observing that along the study, they had many changes. So first, the user was 30 years of age and male, then it was female, 25 years of age, and so on. And when we asked, how is it possible that you are changing so many times the user? I mean, in the delegation log, we only have one user. Why is this occurring? And the answer was, well, we just don't want to disclose private information of the user, which honestly was surprising for us, and the fact that they don't understand that, for example, an ECRF is not a public web. Despite it's in the internet, it's a, let's say, it's a protected area. So concepts relative to the use of the ECRF created this kind of errors. Other examples relative to compliance with study procedures were the fact that we discovered that some investigators were performing treatments, additional treatments beyond the protocol specified time frame. That's just because they thought that the treatments that they did were not sufficiently effective, so creating, as said, big difficulties. Or, for example, the incorrect use of the device. So in our cases, we had to set the device with certain parameters relative to the patient characteristics, and in certain circumstances, they just forgot to update, and so some patients were overtreated and some other patients were undertreated because they forgot to change the settings of the device. And probably one of the biggest mistakes that the investigators have done was the underestimation of the workload. So even we tried to describe and explain which are the duties and the difficulties of running a study. Still, this has, I mean, this was really underestimated, and in certain circumstances, we had to renegotiate the budget, the investigator fees, because they realized that the workload. So was so much higher compared to what they were thinking at the beginning that they had to ask for additional compensation. So this is just to give you an idea of the type of problems that can arise when you have to deal with non-conventional sites. So heading along to the conclusions, regarding site selections. So the first part, which were the solutions that we implemented. So to try to get through nursing homes, we did an extensive research on PubMed, who had, so we found names of key opinion leaders or experts in the field who had publicated articles with nursing homes, and we asked them to introduce us. So we first got in contact with the key opinion leaders and asked them to introduce us to a nursing home, and this is what actually happened. And you get in contact with the first one, then the first one gets you in contact with the second one, and so on and so on. So we ended up in enrolling 5 nursing homes in the study, which was exactly within the target that we were aiming at. Another suggestion is to do pre-study visits, let's say possibly on site. I know that most of the companies and the sponsors tend to save money, so trying to do remote activities. With this kind of setting, we have, I mean, with non-traditional sites, we really do encourage to do pre-study visits to assess and to explain what is the workload and what does running a clinical study really mean. Because this kind of information is really something new for the investigators. And again, trying to save money, proposing small budgets will only cause additional problems, because at the end, the sites will realize that the workload is much higher than what is expected, and then you will end up in renegotiating the investigator fees, and so you will end up wasting time in having addendum to the contract and so on. And as I said, try to be very clear when you explain the roles, the duties, and which are the expectations when running a clinical study. Moving forward, so what did we really learn, and what are the suggestions that I want to discuss? So invest a lot of time in GCP training. The role of the CRA with the site is not only to be a controller, but to really collaborate with site staff, making them understand what I mean good clinical practice are. And what we did also was to provide so aside of the regular GCP training that is done during site initiation visits, we also requested the site staff to follow online courses, which did have a test at the end to get a certification. And there are free online courses that can provide this thing, so we strongly recommend to do so. Also, considering the type of errors that we have observed, I mean, when you are developing the monitoring plan, try to not only focus on the, let's say, most important key elements, but think out of the box. Try to add additional verification steps, because you will never know what type of errors the sites will make. And most importantly is the fact that being the investigators, not knowing what does a really clinical study mean? They are not aware of the consequences. As Katalin also mentioned, the fact that you may end up in excluding part of the subjects because you had major protocol deviations is a very big problem that, I mean, needs to be really avoided. And as a last slide, just want to let you have the take-home message. So when you have to deal with unconventional, non-traditional settings, so take nothing for granted. So really think out of the box and expect the unexpected.
Burden on staff has been mentioned several times, and that is not necessarily unexpected, but maybe the extent to how much that burden really is. And I think that's as a clinician, that's near and dear to my heart, that we really need to take into consideration when doing any post-market activities that involve clinical staff. So that, and then the warning on the dates that you talked about, Matteo, where they kept trying to change it until it got to a good place. So I don't know if you would expect that, but when you talked about that, that really hit me when I'm reviewing clinical projects around why, you know, IFUs just aren't that effective in reducing risks that are found because of that human, just tell me what you want. Yeah, just how those aren't really effective in mitigating risks. That really made me kind of chuckle when you gave that example. I'll just say one other thing, that clinical staff often aren't aware of how their input into devices is important, because a lot of them don't understand about reporting device malfunctions and their part in that. And that might be something for us all to consider as well.
I would like to add something that is really applicable rather for legacy devices that we usually see with the introduction of the MDR, that they do come with data gaps. And for a quick fix, they usually try to do a PMCF study. But what we see as a notified body, and I would like to zoom out a little bit now, generally for the PMCF studies, if they are not integrated well with the clinical evaluation report methodology. So within the PMCF studies, the performance and safety endpoints should match with the clinical evaluation report that was defined in the clinical evaluation report. And therefore, their outcome parameters can be actually used in the clinical evaluation. So manufacturers and CROs also have to take into consideration not only deliver clinical data per se, but that clinical data is useful from the regulatory standpoint of view. Also, I'm going to give you an example here. So, for example, if a study for a dermal filler for the endpoints were presented like investigator satisfaction scores, patient satisfaction scores, but within the clinical evaluation report, something totally else is that is not even remotely aligned being defined. For example, duration in effect in months or reduction in wrinkle severity on a validated scale. These two are not comparable at all. So in these cases, the data is still provided, money is spent, but the study is not going to be presentable within the clinical evaluation. Therefore, it's not necessarily useful for the clinical evaluation. And I think it's also important to mention that manufacturers should really communicate the clinical evaluation report with the CRO, because that's the way they can really ensure. And we had a short discussion with Daniela as well, and she says that sometimes it happens, right? Sometimes it's not. But at the end of the day, all of this should be coming from the clinical evaluation report. So then all of these reports and the studies really become like one big big part of the PMCF strategy as well. So the planning starts within the clinical evaluation report.
Is there any leeway in non-traditional settings, or are they held to the exact same standards as universities?
I'm gonna stab and then maybe Caitlin can add to it. I really don't like it when they use the word lenient. So I struggle with that when manufacturers ask that question to me. But I'm gonna say that for me, for my reviews, when I see studies that are done in the context of real world use, usually we're not looking for, is this effective or not? We're usually looking more for non-inferiority, and does this at least meet state of the art? So that in itself changes the study itself. So deeper, contextually appropriate data, sure, do I need 100? Maybe I only need a 50 because of, as I said, the data is contextually rich. So that to me is more the question than, looking for leniency.
What I would like to add is it also depends what kind of clinical data is already available. Because the clinical evidence should be coming from the clinical evaluation report. And if we see strong clinical evidence with high scientific validity clinical studies, then the further PMCF studies doesn't necessarily need to be that high quality. And then can move to non-traditional settings. However, if we already see something loose data being collected from private practices, then that really leaves us in a challenging position whether to accept further non-traditional setting clinical data. So it depends on really what is in the clinical evaluation, I would say that.
So the next question is, if there is a minor/major change, which that's a huge difference, on the PMCF design, as what the PMCF plan in the CR, how do we usually handle it? Should we talk to the notified body first for a discussion on the change? I would assume yes.
Absolutely, yes. Please do contact your notified body and probably talk to the clinical reviewers or a clinical expert in the field, whether the change that is proposed, I guess in this case, it's just proposed change, not already a documented change, is still going to be acceptable. I mean, like, it's always worth to have a discussion than rather being picked up during a surveillance audit and then you cannot take it back once it's been done. So if you're gonna, I had these discussions already, and it absolutely makes sense to discuss with the notified body first.
Thank you.
Yeah, or even worse, your certificate application fails if the change does not meet the expectations for sufficient clinical data, right? So there's also that risk. So yes, please talk to us. We're not that bad.
Daniela, regarding to site budget, as per your experience, do most of the sites expect a full procedure cost to be covered by the sponsor? What is the usually negotiable factor with the site?
It's always a balance because, of course, sponsors tend to save money as much as possible, and there is the fact that those type of sites, non-traditional settings, that are not used to do studies, so they do not know exactly what to ask. So I believe that somehow the support of a CRO can be beneficial in these circumstances because we can provide some advice also to step in the discussions. So as we have seen, the risk is that you tend to underpay the site, so have a low budget, which makes the sponsor happy, but at the end of the story will not. I mean, it's not a reality, because the site will realize soon that what they are being paid is not sufficient to cover the workload. So, I mean, it's a complex matter when it comes to budget negotiation. My suggestion is try to be as fair as possible.
Can I add just something? So what's critical is that it's specified somewhere, and that's often lacking. What is a study procedure? What is a standard of care procedure? So if the study is observational, the sponsor should never pay, unless they have reasons for willing to pay, but should never pay for treatment, because treatment is done as part of standard of care and you only collect the data. Okay, so this is critical. And if there's confusion there, the risk, and we have seen that, is that the sites would ask for paying for an implantation that they would have done anyway. But since this is part of the clinical study, I'm asking you money. So yeah, I mean, just that.